Chapter 37 of Genesis commences a new storyline as the narrative shifts from Jacob to his 11th son, Joseph. We're just briefly introduced to Joseph. We're told about the jealous animosity between he and his brothers, their plot to rid themselves of him by selling him to ancient human traffickers, and then Joseph's arrival in Egypt, where he's sold to an influential official named Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. As the tension builds in Joseph's story, we expect the drama to continue right over into chapter 38, but it doesn't. Instead, we're told a sordid tale about his brother Judah that frankly seems totally out of place. Especially so if we were to omit chapter 38, read the last verse of 37, and then the first of 39. Here's what we would find. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. You see, it's as if Moses, who penned Genesis, of course, knew that chapter 38 was an interruption in Joseph's tale, and so he repeats the last part of his story and takes it from there. It's a bit like the story of Adam naming the animals in chapter 2. God says that it's not good for Adam to be alone, that he'll make him a companion. But before he does, we have two verses where God has Adam name the animals. Only then does God put Adam to sleep and create Eve. That seeming two-verse interruption of naming the animals provokes us to ask why it's there. And that leads to an important discovery. The long hours of naming the animals impressed on Adam they each had a mate. It didn't take him long to realize he didn't. So now, not just being alone, but feeling lonely, he longed for a companion, which God provided by one perfectly suited for him. So chapter 38 seems an interruption that provokes us to ask why it's there. This story explains why Jacob's family needed to be taken out of Canaan for a time. Back in chapter 15, God told Abraham that his descendants would be taken out of Canaan for several generations and then would return 400 years later. God made a most cryptic remark. He said that Israel would return when the iniquity of the Amorites was complete. Now, the Amorites were the main people group living in the land of Canaan, and the term Amorite was their tribal or their ethnic identity, while that title, Canaanite, referred to where they lived. And just like today, the title American means people who live in the USA. But we have lots of different ethnic and racial identities. There's Caucasian, Hispanic, Scandinavian, African, Asian, bunch more. It's important to understand that in Israel's conquest of Canaan after the Exodus, God was using Israel as the instrument of his judgment on the wicked Canaanites. They were a culture that had gone completely over into the most abominable forms of idolatry and cruel debauchery. They practiced massed human and infant sacrifice. They were wholly given over to the worship of sex and power. They had sinned themselves literally past the point of repentance, and so God used Israel to judge them. At the time of Jacob's family, the Canaanites were on their way to that place. They weren't there yet. They were getting close. This story in chapter 38 makes it clear why Israel had to be removed from Canaan as the Canaanites slipped into increasing abomination. If they weren't removed, the danger was that they'd go down with them. And so chapter 38 is crucial because it shows why God sent Joseph to Egypt. The narrative so far says that it was his brother's cruelty that dropped Joe as a slave in Egypt. But the whole story, once told, makes it clear that God works all things together for those who trust him. Verse 1. It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. Now, why Judah chose to leave his family at this time, it's not stated. Maybe that whole thing with Joseph had put some caution in him regarding his treacherous brothers. You see, now that Joseph was out of the way, the question of inheritance becomes center stage. Which of the sons will Jacob favor now? Well, Reuben's out because of his incest with his stepmother. The next two, Simeon and Levi, are out because of their treachery at Shechem. That meant Judah was next in line, and he may have split to avoid a plot against him. Adullam was a Canaanite city-state in the south-central region of what's called the Shephelah, the sloping plain that joins the western coast to the central hills. How Judah knew Hirah, it's not given. Most likely they had met in those days when he had been leading the family flocks across the region in search of pasture. Adullam really wasn't all that far from the main family base at Mamre. We read in verse 2, "And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her." Now, wait, what? Is Judah supposed to be hooking up with a Canaanite wife? You see, we have a problem, a rather big one. Because of Jacob's conniving machinations with his father-in-law Laban, there's no going back to Mesopotamia for wives for Jacob's sons. That bridge has been burned. So where are they supposed to acquire spouses? Well, it's going to have to be from the locals since there's simply no other option. Judah sees a woman that he likes, the daughter of someone named Shua, and he marries her. Verse 3, "So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name which means watchful. She conceived again, bore a son, called his name Onan, which means strong." Verse 5, "She conceived yet again, bore a son, called his name Shelah, which means request. He was at Chezib when she bore him." Now, we have no idea where Chezib was. It was one of several places in the Bible that simply passed out of knowledge. Verse 6, "Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him." As was custom, Judah arranged a wife for his eldest son. That wife's name was Tamar, another Canaanite. But was a wicked man, and for reasons simply explained as God's judgment, he died. Though the text doesn't specify sin, that doesn't stop some commentators from suggesting what it was. But since the text is silent, I think it's best for us to be as well. The important thing is to realize that Judah's son had been corrupted by his surroundings. That corruption was great enough that it required swift judgment. An important lesson here for Christian parents. The world will influence our children. The challenge to us is how it will influence them. The only way to avoid it would be to move off to some secluded commune in unpopulated wilds where there's no internet. And that's not practical, nor do I believe that it's God's will. Church history has already tried the hermits, monks, and monasteries deal. It didn't work real well. I want to share an observation. Parents who try to sequester and hide their children from the world, they have good intentions, but often do more harm than good. I've witnessed parents who attempt to shield their kids from the world by not having TV, forbidding radio, no movies, internet. They homeschool. They don't even participate in a homeschool support group because they don't want to expose their kids to other influences. Some keep their children with them in church because they don't trust Sunday schools. They won't let their teens join a youth group for fear of influences that they don't approve of. And inevitably, when their children become young adults, they run off into all the stuff their parents tried to keep them out of. They resent the controlling that they had to endure for 16, 17, 18 years. Because they were never exposed to the world's enticements, they have no capacity for handling them. A far better strategy is for parents to raise children to know how to be in the world but not of it, to recognize the lies that shape the world and know the truth that dispels those lies. We are called to wage spiritual warfare, not to be spiritual hermits. We are called to be light to the world, not under a box. Salt resists decay because it's in contact with the world, not sitting in a 50-year-old salt shaker. Parents, the world is going to influence your children. It's our job to make sure that influence works for God's glory, not against it, by training our children how to channel that influence into goodness rather than sin. Judah left the household of faith and journeyed to the moral wasteland of Canaan. His compromise left little ground for raising godly sons. It was his family who suffered. According to custom, if a man died before producing children, it was his next oldest brother's duty to go to his widow and father a child on his behalf and in his name. It's called levirate marriage and will later be codified into the law of Moses. This was done so the dead brother's property would stay in the family under his name, and so his widow would have children to support her in her old age. Verse 8, and Judah said to Onan, that's Er's next eldest brother, go in to your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass that when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore he killed him also. The sibling rivalry that marked Jacob's house is duplicated in Judah's. Onan despised his brother Besides, he wanted the firstborn rights for himself. He wasn't about to be part of a scheme where his despised brother took the prize that he wanted. So, how do I say this? How do I put this decorously? Onan bypassed his duty. He refused to get his sister-in-law pregnant. So he was judged by God. Judah's boys are dropping like flies. With and Onan gone, there's only one more son to fulfill the duty of levirate marriage, Shelah, but he's too young. Verse 11. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown. For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So Judah says that Shelah's not old enough, but in truth, he has no intention of allowing him to go anywhere near Tamar. Judah thinks that she's a black widow, and so he tells Tamar to head home to her father's house till Shelah's older. He's probably hoping that she'll strike up a romance with one of her fellow Canaanites, and that'll be the end of her connection to his family. Well, Judah doesn't know his daughter-in-law very well. Verse 12. Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted, and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. So the official time for mourning the death of a spouse was 7 days. When it says that Judah was comforted, it doesn't mean that he was over his sorrow at the loss of his wife, and that could go on for months, literally, sometimes even years. It simply means that the official time for mourning her is complete. And while his loss was real, the needs of fields and flocks didn't stop. And so he and his buddy Hira went to where his sheep were being sheared. Shearing, that was when the flock paid off. Judah wanted to make sure that he got a good deal for the wool. Verse 13. And it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought that she was a harlot because she had covered her face. So time's passed. Shelah's old enough now to fulfill the duty of levirate marriage, but Judah has ignored her. She knows what's up. Her father-in-law has written her off. Note that she's still wearing her widow's garment. She hadn't set it aside after the official time of mourning and the loss of her spouse, the creep that he was. She wasn't trying to win the affection of some other guy. She was trusting in her father-in-law to fulfill his promise and his duty. When she realized that he had no intention to, she took matters into her own hands. She put off her mourning clothes, put on something sexy, and parked where she knew that Judah would have to pass on his way to Timnah. As we look at Tamar's story, we discover that while Judah's side journey in Canaan led to corruption in his family, well, it looks like it also led to salvation for the lost. It seems Tamar had learned the story of Jacob's family. She heard of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Faith was kindled in her. She was determined that she would be part of the promise. If Judah wouldn't give her Shelah, well, she'd set her eyes a little higher and go after Judah himself. She knew that his wife was dead and that he would likely be looking for some, well, female companionship. And so she adopted the style and setup of that time and place that a prostitute would. When Judah passed by, sure enough, he assumed she was for hire. Verse 16. Then he turned to her, by the way, and said, please let me come into you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And so she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? Judah obviously doesn't know it's Tamar because it said that she was covered herself with a veil. He asks for service. She plays along by, well, negotiating a price. And he says, verse 17, he said, I will send a young goat from the flock. In other words, let's get busy now, and then I'll send along payment later. So she said, will you give me a pledge that you will send it? In other words, give me some collateral till the payment arrives. Verse 18, then he said, well, what pledge shall I give you? So she said, your signet and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand. Then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Now, Tamar was clever. She knew this was a prime time for her to get pregnant. She agreed to take Judah's distinctive signet, which he carried on a cord around his neck. This would be a seal that was pressed into wax as a way to mark ownership in items or to seal official documents. You might think of it like a notary public. His shepherd's staff, that was a symbol of his authority. Every staff had a distinctive shape to it. Judah was a fool to part with these things since they were the chief symbols of his identity and authority. But they weren't really of any good to some random woman that he had sex with. Their only value was in that what they meant to Judah. Like if someone stole my wallet, the pictures in it would mean nothing to the thief, but they'd mean a lot to me. Judah assumed that they served as collateral for that reason alone, and that the woman would have no need or desire for them beyond her awareness that they were important to him. And so they ensured that he would send payment back. The problem is, Tamar did want them precisely because they did identify him. Verse 19. And so she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. So Tamar went back to her father's house, pretended nothing had happened. She was, waiting for the bun to rise, if you will. Judah had promised to give her a kid from the flock. He got it partly right. He gave her a kid all right, just not from the flock. Verse 20. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he didn't find her. Then he asked the men of the place, saying, Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, There's no harlot in this place. They say, What you talking about, Willis? We got no whores around here. Verse 22. So he returned to Judah and said, I can't find her. Also, the men of the place said that there is no harlot in this place. Then Judah said, Let her take them for herself, lest we be shamed, for I sent this young goat, and you have not found her. So Judah let the matter die because any further inquiry is going to draw attention to the shameful act and fact that he had paid for sex. Verse 24. And it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she's with child by harlotry. And so Judah said, Bring her out and let her be burned. So Judah, buddy, it's okay to use a harlot, but it's not okay to be one. A shocking but not uncommon double standard there. And let's be honest, this is really what Judah was hoping for all along. He wanted some way to get rid of Tamar, and this seemed the perfect excuse. She was pregnant, but not by Shelah. So she must have been with someone else. Judah's self-righteous anger is about to blow up in his face. Verse 25. When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, Please determine whose these are, the signet and cord and staff. So Judah acknowledged them and said, She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son. And he never knew her again. Judah was busted. He was more in error than she because he'd not fulfilled his promise nor duty to give her Shelah. And if it was wrong for her to play the harlot, it was no less wrong for him to use one. Moses tells us after the birth of this child, Judah had no more relations with Tamar. Verse 27. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, This one came out first. And then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly, and she said, How did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Breach, Perez. Verse 30. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah, which means rise up or rising. Now this midwife was skilled enough to realize that Tamar had twins. And since twins are often mixed up at birth, midwives wisely will tie a cord around the firstborn's wrist or ankle as a way to identify who was first. In this case, one stuck a hand out, got the cord, but then his brother ended up emerging first. Chapter 38 is certainly not a picture of the moral superiority of Jacob's family. It shows the danger that Canaanite culture presented. And it helps explain why they had to be carted off to Egypt for a few hundred years. In verse 26, Judah says of Tamar, She has been more righteous than I. If Tamar's actions can in any way be called righteous, and he deems her as more so than he, things are indeed headed south for the family of faith and promise. This chapter also stands as proof of the inspiration of Scripture. It doesn't cast Judah in a positive light. In fact, Genesis' portrait of its heroes is appallingly honest and frank. It paints them warts and all. If Scripture was penned by mere mortals apart from divine inspiration, its writers would have, sanitized and edited the story to make them look better. If Genesis was simply a story about people instead of about God, we'd see those people in a much kinder light. But there's only one hero in the Bible, Jesus. All others are sinners saved by grace.